Day. As I mentioned, February, this is February the 1st is when we're recording this. February is focused on the people side of business. And it's the theme of all of our programming and all of our content for the month of February. And HR ends up being a huge piece and component of that, just in all the ways that we relate with each other. Communication is a huge part of that, relationships. And so right now, when we were really thinking about the programming and what's going on from that people side of business right now, so we're all really focused on what's next, whether it's how to rebuild our company, how to build our company, whether it's looking at building our own career and looking for new opportunities. And although that's always been the case, COVID has certainly thrown a wrench into all of that, or at least it's thrown some changes, and some of them for the good, and some of them they're going to create some hurdles and opportunities and things like that. So there's just a lot of factors that go into it. And so we thought if there's anyone for us to sit down and chat with who is deeply connected with the ins and outs of all the trends, the legalities of HR, it's Erin Lemmons. So I'm really excited that Erin is leading this program with us today. Real quick too, our motto for 2021 here at Rise is together we can do so much. And our programming, I think, really lives that out better than anything else, which is that we have as individuals knowledge and experience. And it's such a gift for us to be able to share that with others and to learn together. So I'm so glad that you guys joined today. And I'm so grateful that Erin is going to be sharing her expertise with us. Erin owns Eolus Consulting, which, as we just learned in Gaelic, means knowledge through experience. So chalk that away and start using that in your vocabulary through the rest of this week. But Erin certainly lives that out as well, knowledge through her incredible experience. So without further ado, I want to turn everything over to my friend Erin Lemmons, who is based out of Denver and has a great interactive, fun, and insight-filled presentation for us today.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you, Katie. I appreciate it. And I am always happy to talk about HR topics. I know it's unusual for people to get excited about HR, but I am one of those people that does. So just to give you a little bit more about myself really quickly in the business, really. So I've been in HR for a little over 20 years at this point, and just made the decision to go into business for myself about 2 years ago. So started a consulting group. And really it is just to support small businesses, because there can be such a disconnect between small businesses and the HR support that they need and what they can actually get. And that oftentimes just results in so much risk for the company. And that's my goal, is to help eliminate or to at least reduce that risk for them. So as Kate mentioned earlier, I provide tools and resources and support in just helping these small businesses navigate the employee experience, building their employment practices, and of course, mitigating their risks. So legal risk and everything that comes with having employees and running a business. So that is me, and that's what I do. And I'm going to share my screen. Kate, do you want me to share my screen now, or should we do the breakout room first and then jump into the screen share, which might be easier to do? Okay, so what I'll do is I'll share the screen, and what we're going to talk about today, you guys, is really just hiring in this new world that we have, right? And as Kate again mentioned, the world has shifted in 1,000 different ways since last year. And as business owners, as solopreneurs, as people who are out in the world seeking jobs or seeking opportunities, it has forced us to be it's forced us to shift along with it, right? And we have looked and done things and managed our businesses in ways I think we never thought that we would. And hiring, of course, is no different. So what I thought we could do to start is just jump into break rooms. And I really would just first like to know what has been your biggest hiring struggle as we've gone through this last year. And why has it been so hard for you? So what have you seen with hiring, and why has it been so hard? And then we'll come back and we'll start to dig into all of the fun stuff. So yeah, as we're coming back, what I'd love to hear is some of your guys' thoughts and some of the conversations that you had. So let me know, what you have felt has been hardest in this last year with hiring, and then, why you think it's been so hard, or what you're looking forward to even.
Hi. So we just talked to I talked most of the time. First we got to know each other. And then I talked and talked and talked. So Brooke was just getting into to what her hiring needs are, but I was just talking about how at my old firm I hired a friend and it actually worked out really well. She was a lawyer, but she didn't want to be a lawyer, so she was great at helping me, but she stayed at my old firm. And so now I was saying, I'm like, yeah, I'm looking at other friends, other people that, oh, do I want to hire them? And then I'm like, well, even though that one worked out really well, maybe that's not the best idea. So I'm looking forward to what you have to say today about, picking the right person.
Sure, sure, sure. Okay. That's a tricky, it can be amazing and it can be really bad at the same time. So, mm,
I can take over. Susie, you did not talk the whole time. I think we split it evenly. I am at a small business in St. Louis. We currently have 8 employees, and we have been like really busy, which is awesome in the past few months, and just really need to hire someone new. And I think the first challenge for a small business, a really small business, is just like taking that step. Like going from 8 people to 9 employees is a really big deal when you're already that small. So like just convincing, like realizing and then convincing my boss that like we really do need the extra help and can justify it and it's the right step has been like the biggest major hurdle, especially since COVID kind of upended some budgets. Though like I said, we're doing okay when we're lucky for that, but
yeah,
that was the biggest hurdle. So now that we are like ready to do it and ready to find someone, it's kind of just like, well, we're working remotely, and so how can we best like set them up to like actually get integrated with our team,
yeah,
because I think we'll be remote for at least a few more months, it seems like.
for sure, for sure. And that's a struggle for a lot of people. So we'll talk about that for sure. Okay. Well, I'm going to get started because I don't want to, I have, as per usual, probably too much content. So let's just jump into this fun stuff. And as I mentioned, you guys, the world has changed in 1,000 different ways. I know I said that already, and we've had to adapt alongside with that, right? Our businesses have had to adapt. We as individuals have had to adapt. As job seekers, we've had to adapt to how things have looked this last year. And I think as much as the world has shifted and as much as we talk so much about, oh, when we get back to normal, when we get back to normal, and I think we will go back to normal, but I think the normal we knew is not going to be the normal we return to, right? Things have shifted, and I think there are some permanent shifts that have come about, and that's certainly no different in the world of hiring, as it is in our individual lives and just in business in general. So and it's interesting because we'll look at some statistics here to get started. And um, ironically, in the last 2 quarters of 2020, productivity, we saw a 10.1, if we're being literal, but a 10% jump in productivity over those last 2 quarters. And overall, employees feeling more satisfied in their positions, which is pretty ironic when you think about all of the things that we've been juggling in this last year, right? So when you think about the fact that, our living rooms are also education centers, there are offices, we've got a million different things and everything is focused in, the hub of your home typically. So add on top of that we're worried about health. There's health risk, there's health concern, there's, loved ones who have gotten sick, and we're managing stress and anxiety that we haven't had to manage before. So you put all that together and you see that amidst all of that, we are still seeing 10% productivity increases is pretty impressive. Um, and it's pushing CEOs and CFOs to think differently about how they work and how their businesses work, right? So majority of CFOs, over 50%, have said that they plan on keeping at least a portion of the workforce remote moving forward into 2021 and beyond. So once the pandemic has receded, they will continue to keep people remote, and that's something that's not going to go away. And so the ways in which we've adapted to manage that through our hiring and our business practices, that's going to stay intact in large part as we move forward and as we continue to go through 2021 and into 2022, so on and so forth. So when we look at that from a hiring perspective, oops, let me just get my computer to work here. When we look at that from a hiring perspective, what we see, and every single business has been impacted in some way, shape, or form, right? So whether you are a business that had to lay people off, whether you are a business that had to furlough people, if you're a business that actually saw growth, which some companies and some industries did, every single person has been impacted in some way, shape, or form, and their hiring practices and their employment practices have been impacted. So when we start to look at moving through, I would say we're a little bit past mid-pandemic, so we're kind of starting to cusp over into the maybe the light at the end of the tunnel, and businesses are starting to think about, okay, how do we come back from this? And 70% of employers are actually thinking at this point that they will backfill 68% of positions that they had to reduce based on COVID. So that's a pretty interesting statistic in and of itself. Basically realizing that, do they have people that can do more than what they thought they could? Are they utilizing people differently because we're now working remote and there's a little bit more time in people's days? They're not commuting. There's all these things that have shifted. Or is it the fact that we have leveraged technology in completely new and different ways? And so we no longer need people in certain positions because of that. So there's all these things that are going on, but a pretty interesting statistic to look at and think about from a business perspective. And then on top of that, we start to look at what our growth fields are, which, not surprising, is going to be technology. With the way in which technology has shifted in the last year, doesn't surprise me that that's a major, and it always has been, but I think will continue to get more and more important. Marketing, sales, and customer service are also top growth fields as we move into this new year. Again, not surprising to me when you think about the businesses, and as employers and owners, and even employees in businesses, we've had to completely shift how we're marketing to our clients, to our consumers, to our job seekers, to potential candidates. Everything has shifted in terms of how are we reaching the people we need to reach, right? And how are we getting buyback and productivity out of that, or return on investment out of that? So not surprising that we see those fields growing. And as a result of all of this, we see a shift in job seeker attitudes and what their expectations are as well. So 58% of candidates now have shifted job expectations, and safety and in the workplace is at the very, very top of the list. So it's really kind of, for lack of a better word, leveled the playing field. And we always say, right, in HR, that you're interviewing as much as you're being interviewed. But I think that has become more and more relevant throughout this last year, because people are kind of taking a little bit of control back in terms of what's important to them and what their expectations are, especially again when you're faced with a pandemic and health anxieties and so on and so forth, things of that nature. So really pretty interesting to see how that shifts. When you look at it from a legal perspective, right, there's a lot of laws that were changed in 2020, or there was a lot of laws that were adopted in 2020, some COVID related, some of course not. And 2021 is going to be no different in that manner. So, oops, I'm going too fast. So I'm going to go through some of the laws that we've seen. Some of these are going to be specific to Colorado. So if you're in St. Louis, just kind of know that. But I would imagine most cities and states at this point have something similar in place. So very, very important to think about that, right? And to know in your specific state or city or locale, wherever you happen to be, important to know what laws are impacting hiring. So in Colorado specific, we have the Equitable Pay for Equitable Work Act that went into effect in January of this year. And the biggest impact this has from a hiring perspective is, as employers, we are now responsible for posting internally and externally every position that we have. So if we are, a company and we're looking to hire somebody in sales, well, we have to post that position to every person that's internal as well. So the way they look at it is every promotional opportunity that would be a promotional opportunity for somebody based off of compensation or skill set needs to be posted internally. So everybody has a fair chance at applying. Now, they have to have the required skill sets, right, in order to be relevant for the job, but they certainly have to be made aware of the opening. And going along with that, you also have to post salary ranges and benefits that the company offers. So those are requirements now in Colorado. And interestingly enough, if you are an employer in St. Louis and you're going to be hiring somebody in Colorado, those laws will apply for that Colorado based position, right? So even if you have a company in New York, but you've got some presence in Colorado, those laws will apply. So it's not necessarily where the business is set, but where the employees are at and how that all interplays. So something to keep in mind there. Along with
Interrupt real quick, Erin. Erin, just thinking like, because especially anymore, so often people are virtual, a remote worker. I mean, sometimes you may not think that your worker is going to be in California or Oregon or something. Maybe you expect someone's going to be in St. Louis, or what if you hire someone when they're in St. Louis? But I've heard of a lot of people, they pick up and then move
yeah.
to a different state. Is there like a good, like the most conservative type state, or is there like a good kind of baseline state to try to base these things off of, just to sort of like protect your cover your bases a little bit if you're not sure where your employee is going to end up being based out of?
I think good practice. And I think as we look at equitability in the world and in the workplace, I think that whether Colorado is one of the top first to adopt this, it's going to shift downward. So I think if we're looking at how can I best protect myself, put your pay ranges and put your benefits in your postings. And I think it's good practice anyway to let your team know, hey, we've got some opportunities. Who in our base wants to do more and wants to grow. So I think it's a good overall practice to do. And I think by doing that, then when it's swings downhill, or when you get to the situations, you've already got a practice in place. You don't have to worry about it as much, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yep. Thank you.
Perfect. Of course. So the other piece with this particular law is that in Colorado specifically, and I'm not sure in St. Louis, but we are no longer able to ask about salary history. So that can't be on the table. You can ask what their target ranges or what they're targeting for this type of role, but you cannot ask what their salary history was. So again, keep in mind, if you are sitting in St. Louis, but you're hiring in Denver, you can't ask about salary history. So just something important to keep in mind, and how it will shift how we look at hiring or how we interview folks moving forward. The Healthy Families and Workplaces Act is another law that was passed in Colorado. I would imagine that most cities and states have something similar at this point in time. This is by and large, it's a sick paid leave law. So you are responsible for paying your employees for any amount of work that they do, for a certain amount of work that they do if they're out sick, right? And the big part of this law is the emergency, the public emergency part of that law, which would be COVID-19, right? So we have a health emergency right now, and that part of the law is in effect, and it really enforces or requires employers to provide additional pay for their team if they're out for COVID related reasons. And the reason I bring this up, and again, I think it's probably, there are similar laws intact in most cities and states at this point to try to protect those who are out sick with COVID. But the reason I bring this up from a hiring perspective is because I think people are very dialed in right now. And as we mentioned, expectations are shifting on the candidate side. So people are very dialed in as to what is an employer going to do? What's going to happen if I do get sick? How am I going to be taken care of? What do I need to anticipate? So that's why I bring that law up. And I think as we look at hiring and how we're going to be moving forward, we need to be prepared to have these type of conversations with employees that we're going to be bringing on. And then the last one I would bring up is ban the box, which simply means you can no longer ask about criminal convictions during an interview process or on an application. Again, you can ask if they have, if they're able to pass a background check. You cannot ask if they have been convicted of a crime. So it's pretty simple, but obviously will impact how we hire and the things that we say when we're looking to make a hire. So, and those are all, laws that have started or have come into effect this year. Some COVID related, some not so COVID related, all impact. What we're going to look at now is how COVID has started to change the actual hiring process, and what we're seeing as quote unquote trends, right, from a hiring perspective. And the biggest part of that is digital is the new normal. And we all experience that every day, right? We're sitting on a Zoom call today, looking at each other and having conversations. Interviewing is no different. And as we mentioned last March, people had to, we were scattering to figure out, how do we bring people on board? What do we do to get people on board in these positions that we still need when we can't be face-to-face and we can't have that face-to-face interaction? So digital really has risen up, right? And technology has become paramount for companies. And there's a lot of different ways people are doing it. There's video interview segments where people will, a company will send you and you will record and send back to them. They'll send you some questions, you'll record yourself answering and you send it back. Or it will be a Zoom type interface or a different platform. But a lot of businesses have moved or have been forced to move to this type of technology. And I can't remember the actual percentage, but it was I think like 30 or 40% of businesses have actually gone through the complete hiring process without ever actually meeting a person in person. So it just shows you how technology has taken over our year and really how it's allowed us to move forward and by and large, a lot of different ways, right? So virtual interviews are here to stay. I think it's important that we pay attention as employers to how we set that up and what that looks like, because there is potential when we're doing things virtually and we start to use AI, right, artificial intelligence, when we start to use that in our recruiting processes, which a lot of companies are doing, how it is pulling out information from a resume in order to showcase to you, or how you're doing different things can certainly unknowingly set you up for some litigation or some potential discrimination. So important that you're paying attention to how your process is set up and what you're doing to ensure that you're not creating any sort of disparate impact in your process, even though it's all virtual. So I think that's a really important piece to keep in mind. And then the other piece to that is paying attention to the process. And remarkably, I think organizations, companies have always been bad at this. I think 10% of candidates who apply for a job and actually start the interview process get follow-up feedback, right, as they move through the process. And 10% is a terrible number. And that's going to become increasingly important that people pay attention to that, right? Because, just as, so with the onset of technology, employers have a more global reach, right? We can cast a global reach and we can find somebody in New York that can do the job here in Colorado, or in St. Louis that can do the job in Hawaii. I mean, we have expanded our candidate pool, right? And our ability to find people. But it also, on the other side of that, has allowed those who are seeking opportunities to expand their reach. And so they're able to go out and find a lot more potential opportunities. And so as a employer, it's really becoming more and more important that you pay attention to the reach and the touch that you have with your candidate base, and how you communicate with them, how you keep them up to date, what technologies you're using, how are you communicating, what the virtual process is going to look like. All of these things are going to impact your brand, and it's also going to impact your ability to capture top talent, right? Because people are looking for businesses that have adapted to this virtual world and are on the ball, right? That are sharp and know how to move through a process. And in the days of not getting feedback, candidates aren't standing for it anymore, right? And it goes by and large with what we're seeing in terms of transparency and communication, and what our employees are expecting of us, and of course to that end, what job seekers and candidates are expecting from us as well. So it becomes more and more important that our processes for finding talent are buttoned up, and that we are communicating with these teams or with these candidates consistently and uniformly, right? So they know what to expect. They know when they're still in play. They know when things are happening. So some big changes there. If we look at it from an interviewee perspective or from a job candidate perspective, employers have really started to modify what's important to them. And your basic skill sets that you need to be effective in a job are always going to be there, right? If I am in a technology role and I need to know certain software programs, that's not going to change, right? But what has changed are the characteristics that companies are looking for, and what they've recognized is super important moving forward into this mid-pandemic year and beyond, right? And what we've realized, obviously, strong communication skills are paramount, and they have to be across different channels, right? So I need somebody who's in sales who can communicate to me via Zoom, via Teams, via text message, via chat boards, via Hangout. Like there's so many different ways, right? And using sales as an example, that we're interacting with potential prospects, that we have to know how to communicate effectively in a variety of different ways, and using different channels to do that. And employers, business owners are getting pretty dialed into what that needs to look like for their businesses to go on and be successful. Of course, with that comes technology competence and our ability to showcase, and we have to be able to showcase this, right? As a job seeker, we have to be able to showcase how we can communicate across different channels, how we are competent in technology, and how we can take new software, new platforms, and adapt to them quickly, right? So the name of the game is flexibility and adaptability. We have to be able to showcase that as a job seeker so that the company has no doubt when I sit in a seat, if I'm in my home sipping coffee and with a dog in my lap, I can still sell to a prospect, right? I can still make a connection and drive the business forward. So that's what people are looking for. And as job interviewees, we have to be prepared. Preparation is so much bigger than it ever was before, right? And it's preparation in a lot of different ways. It's preparing for the interview, and it's preparing for doing life in a different way. Our brains are geared to work best in 3D, right? We recognize information in 3D, and we're in a 2D world by and large right now. So it makes everything a little bit harder for our brains. And that's, when you think about, my God, I'm so tired at night. How am I so tired? I haven't even left my house. Our brains are receiving information and acting and having to act on that information differently than it has in the past. And we have to be prepared for that. And we have to be able to showcase how we can push past that as a job seeker, right? So that employers want us as part of their team. So that's a big part of it. And a lot of it goes to making a first impression. And how do we do that? How do we do that in a virtual world, right? How do I set myself up? And again, preparing, understanding the market, understanding the competition, understanding your competition and who you're up against is also important, I think, and how many people you're up against. Creating a workspace that is conducive to your ability to focus. And we were just talking about, as people were jumping on, we were talking about how much more tolerant we've gotten and how much more accepting we've gotten of the fact that people are human beings and things happen, right? We've got dogs that bark and mailmen that ring doorbells and kids that are running across screens in the middle of the day. And there's so much going on. And as human beings, we get it because we are forced into this situation where we have to adapt. That being said, when you know that you are preparing for an interview, or when you know that you need to make an impression, you have to really take the time to set yourself up for that, right? So preparing your space, making sure that your software is working, making sure that your internet speed is appropriate, and all of those things are set up. So you're jumping on before the interview, you're making sure it's set up and ready to roll. You're making sure that you are in a space where you can focus without any distractions, right? Or that you're limiting your distractions. And I've seen some crazy, crazy things over the last year. I've seen people that have jumped on interviews and they're eating egg sandwiches and things are dribbling down their chin. And I've seen, somebody actually stopped an interview to talk to their child about where they were going. And and I get it, but it was like a 5 or 6 minute conversation with their child. And then they're like, okay, I'm back now. And those sort of things are a huge distraction, right? It's a huge distraction as an employer trying to make a decision on whether or not you are the right person for the job. Right. And it just sets a poor impression. And we just have forgotten, I think, a little bit that, a year ago, if we were going into an interview, we'd sit in a room, we'd be by ourselves, we'd have our professional suit on, right? Now we might have a professional top on and we might be wearing our yoga pants. So it's just all these things we have to think about, right? And putting our best foot forward and preparing our mind and our spaces to do the same, if that makes sense. So, taking all that into account, let's say that you've made a hire. So now we're going to step into kind of what happens or what expectations do people have in regards to hiring and coming on to work, right? Coming on board. There's a lot of questions swirling around about vaccines and as an employer, should I require vaccinations? Can I require vaccinations? If I do require vaccinations and somebody can't get vaccinated, then what happens? Or what happens if people won't come to work because people haven't been vaccinated? There's all these things that are just swirling around as we continue to move through this pandemic. And what I imagine over the next 6 months, we will continue to see a lot more in the way of this and guidance as to what employers should do. What I can tell you now is that the EEOC has said that yes, you can require a vaccine, and that if you have people who are not able to take that vaccine for medical reasons or for religious reasons, that they are that you have an accommodation or you're able to accommodate them in some way, shape, or form. So that's what we know. What I would say best practice is that you can encourage your teams to take a vaccine, right? And you can prepare yourself as an employer as to what strategies are you going to have in place? What plans and policies will you have in place to protect your team? And this is where transparency and communication come into play, right? So, and going back to the expectations, not only of job candidates, but also of employees, and what we are expecting differently than what we expected a year ago in terms of our employers and where we're coming to work. And that really is transparency and communication. I want to know what you expect of me. I want to know what's happening, and not, it's I think a little bit of a difficult transition for employers, because it's like, well, how transparent should I be? How much do I need to communicate? What's too much? What's not enough? How do I keep things confidential? There's so many things that swirl around that, right? But I think having really a plan in place and creating, communication to your team that will tell them, here's what happens. So if you're vaccinated, here's what, here's it from an exposure standpoint, what our policy is. If you haven't been vaccinated, here's from an exposure standpoint, what our policy is. If you get these symptoms, here's what we expect you to do as an employee. From a travel standpoint, here's what we're asking our employees. Here's what we'd like you to let us know about, those sort of things. So it's communicating and giving them some guidance as to what they can expect. And those things, right, will start to reduce the level of anxiety that people have as they go back into the workforce, especially when you have people who have been hired remote and have never been into the workplace before, right? So this is their first step into that as we get back to that sense of work, right? And it's just knowing that remote work, as we mentioned in the beginning, is pretty much here to stay. So looking at what are your remote arrangements, what flexible opportunities do you have to offer your staff who are still concerned before we get herd immunity and everything is a little bit more relaxed? How do we manage those people, be them new hires or not? How do we manage their expectations, and how can we support them and continue to get the most productivity out of them at the same time, if that makes sense? So those are the things we look at. When we are transparent and when we communicate to our teams, we reduce the risk of the pitfalls, the legal pitfalls that we have seen. And interestingly enough, so the last 2 quarters of 2020, what we saw, obviously we're starting to see COVID-19 lawsuits come into play. And by and large, what we saw at the end of 2020 was wrongful termination suits. What we're hearing and what legal partners and lawyers are starting to feel is that we will see a lot more discrimination, safety, and wage and hour claims that come out in relation to COVID-19. And so when you look at your hiring, and this is hiring practices as well as, right, employment practices. I would be remiss if I just didn't sneak in some employment practices in there somewhere. So super important that we're paying attention to how we manage our processes. So when we think about discrimination, right? Discrimination is choosing perhaps not to hire somebody who's 75 years old because we worry about their potential exposure in the work environment. So we make a decision not to hire that person so that we can and hire the person who's younger and not as exposed. That's discrimination, right? From an age standpoint. So it's thinking through how that works, not, somebody, if I skip down to disability, right? And under the ADA, if somebody is, part of the vulnerable population in the form of they have an illness or they have a chronic disease that doesn't allow that makes them more vulnerable, our inability to work through an interactive process with them and see what sort of accommodations exist, that would be discrimination or disability over disability. So that would come into play in the workforce. And it's all these things we just have to start thinking through, right? Pregnancy, even as an example, if I'm looking at hiring somebody, or if somebody's come to work for me and it's their first time in the office, let's say I hired somebody remote, she comes in, she's 6 months pregnant, and I tell her she can't be in the workspace because she's pregnant and I'm too worried it's dangerous for COVID exposure. Well, that's discrimination. It's not my choice to make that. It's not my choice to make that decision as an employer. It's that employee's choice to make that decision whether or not she feels comfortable coming into the workplace. My obligation as an employer is to make sure that I am creating a safe environment for my team and that I'm following CDC guidelines, that I'm following the rules and regulations that have been established to help keep my team safe. That's what's important. But we have to start thinking through all of these things, right? And we have to start thinking about health and safety. So mask adherence. And I know, a lot of people feel strongly one way or the other about masks. And the bottom line is, when you're in a work environment, it's important that you are protecting your team. And if the state mandate or the federal mandate says masks need to be worn, well, as a business owner, I need to make sure that's happening, because that is a step in protecting my employees, right? And these are the questions I think you can expect job seekers to start to ask, right? What are you doing to keep your environment safe? What are you doing to keep the work environment safe? So you need to be prepared to answer those questions as you go through this hiring process, right? And then last really is where and how we work, and that's wage and hour. And it is, if I make a hire again with somebody out in Oregon or somebody in St. Louis, how does that change or impact the taxes that I have to pay? How does that change my wage and hour structure? And I need to be thinking about that when I'm making hires, if they're not in the same state. Likewise, if I'm making a hire and everybody's working remote and they're an hourly employee, I need to think about how I'm tracking their time, right? Because they're owed overtime if they work overtime. So, and as we all know, if I'm a new hire, I want to make a first impression. I'm going to do extra work. I'm going to work as hard as I can. And let's say I clock out at 5 p.m. and my boss sends me an email at 8 and I'm sitting on the couch. I'm like, oh, I'm just going to answer that really quick. And it takes me 10 minutes to answer that question. Well, did they clock in for that time? Because that's compensable time, right? And as an employer, it's our obligation to make sure we're paying them for all time that is worked. So it's really important that we're paying attention to what our processes are and our practices are around hiring and onboarding and making sure that those team members are being paid what they should be paid. Those are, I think those are some of the bigger legal pitfalls that we kind of face as we move through the rest of this pandemic and as we start to, again, come into this new sense of normal and what that looks like. So I think all things that people need to be prepared for. And really, that's pretty much all I have. I like to end with quotes always. So my quote for today is this from Socrates, and it's: "The secret of change is to focus all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." And I think it is so perfect for the world we live in today and where we're at. And I think as much shifting and as much change as we've seen, there's been so much good. And Kate and I were talking about that as well, which the ingenuity and the creativity that we've seen has been really, really stellar and impressive. And I think we'll continue to see that on a technology front and ways to engage and communicate with our teams, and really every other front there is. So I think focus on the positive, and God willing, we'll hit the top of the mountain sooner than later. So that's all I have. I have no idea where I'm at with time, but I will let you guys open any questions that you have.
Yeah, as I say, this is good. We've got about 10 minutes. And as I say, especially got me thinking, Brooke and Sarah, I know you said you guys were actively, kind of in the search fund and in the hiring space and world. But of course, anyone with questions that you may have, either digging deeper into some of the answers and information Erin gave, or questions that she, topics that she didn't bring up.
Erin, I'm Sarah. I think everything you said resonates very, very well right now. I mean, I have spent the last 8 years doing executive recruitment, so more at the senior leadership level and C-suite. And again, I think everything that you mentioned today is completely on point. COVID has brought a huge disruption in just completely unexpected ways to hiring at every level. And we've seen that, employers change their minds regarding pay rates and compensations when COVID hit, and employees are accepting jobs taking those jobs, setting start dates, and then backing out of those offers later. I mean, just a complete and utter disruption, I guess would be the best word to say right now. So I would absolutely agree. And I love your Socrates quote at the end. I think that's
Good.
absolutely on point too. So thank you. Nice to meet you.
You as well. Thank you. And I do think you're right. And I think that disruption is the hardest part, right? Is figuring out. And I think that's where our communication strategies have to be so dialed in when we're talking about job seekers and candidates and how we're keeping that touch with them. Because it's a totally different world, right? You would say something and they'd have a start date 2 weeks out and you wouldn't talk to them again until they started. And you can't do that now because it's a constant, there's got to be constant reassurance, constant communication about, why it's the right thing to do. Because if you don't do that, they fall off the board 100%.
Yeah. Complete engagement, like throughout the entire process, is the biggest tip for hiring managers right now. Yeah, totally agree.
I heard, in dating, the term ghosting was, popularized, within the past few years. But I read about something that, like, within hiring, just people, mostly, candidates, but even in hires, people just ghosting on you, and so going silent. And so, yeah, it's like if there isn't that constant engagement on both sides, you guys are saying.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? Because as much pain as it causes an employer, on the flip side of that, and where job seekers are frustrated, it's like, oh my gosh, I went through 2 interviews and now it's been 3 weeks and I've heard nothing. And it's so detrimental right now for brand awareness, even, right, for the business. And that's so important as we're navigating this new world we live in and how we touch our consumers, right?
Absolutely. What other questions? Anybody else have something want to dig in deeper? Oh, Brooke, hey.
Hi. Yeah, so Erin, I have kind of a question. I know you mentioned several times, like, you could be in Denver and hiring someone in Portland or hiring someone in St. Louis because, my firm is certainly like working remotely right now. And that is, of course, theoretically possible. But I think that we still would prefer to have somebody in St. Louis, hopefully like there is a time when it's safe to return to work together in offices at some point. But like, I guess, like, is it the norm is there a norm either way in terms of hiring someone in your city or not in your city right now? And, or does it really just come down to like transparency and communication about what we're looking for?
So I think there have been norms. I think, but prior to 2020, prior pandemic, the norm was in an office, right? We expected people to be butts in a seat and doing the thing. I think COVID completely fractioned that, right? And because people have had to adapt, I think right now we're kind of in this playing phase. So businesses are really feeling it out. And it's like, oh my gosh, if I can get a team that's happier and more productive because they're working remote and it's saving me money from a cost standpoint in an office, is that the way I should go? And I think it will be a while before we really shake out, is there a new standard? Because I think for businesses, it is very hard to give up the control and the desire to have somebody face to face. I think it's very hard to let that go. So I think we're in this weird, like I said, kind of a playing phase, and we're seeing what works. I think that what is going to change it is the candidates, right? And what their expectations are, because by and large, they've been able to drive a lot of what's been happening. And I think that they have come to some conclusions in terms of how they want their life to work and how they want their work to look. And I think that will drive businesses and how they respond to that. Because if I'm getting top talent and my goal is top talent, then I'm going to get that top talent any way I can. Right? If I have a stellar person who's in St. Louis and I'm in Denver, and I have the other candidate here in Denver is, they're okay. How am I going to set my company up? And so I think those are the things that people are going to start to fight with and figure out how they move forward. And I like I said, I think it will be a little ways before we actually shake out and see, do we have a new normal in relation to that? Or do we kind of start to go back to what was?
And Erin, I think some of those policies that you were talking about, the vast majority of small and mid-sized employers don't have those remote virtual policies in place. And so it is hard. It's a little bit of a dangerous situation to bring on a remote employee when you don't have that pinned down, of course, unless you are an office of 2 or 3. But a lot of the larger organizations have them, right? So they can compete in a very clear-cut manner and tell candidates what that means. Yeah, but I will say, Brooke, a lot of the smaller and mid-sized employers that I've worked with over the last few years they're unhappy about this whole virtual situation because they truly believe their culture is their people, and their people being together is a part of that culture. And so I think it's going to take some time, like Erin said, to really shift out and see where folks land on it. But it's a cool topic. I could talk about it forever.
Me
This
too.
is like a ridiculous question, but like, could geographic discrimination become a thing? Like, hey, I'm a willing, qualified XYZ candidate. I want to, but I didn't get this job because I'm in Denver, even though this great company in St. Louis, like they're open to it. But like, I know that that's not at this point a discriminate, but like, could that become a thing where you could end up getting, or if you're an employee who says, hey, I want to relocate to Miami, because why not? I technically can as an employer, can you have, it's just like that, are you legally allowed to say, I'm really sorry that that's what you want? And yes, I know it's technically possible, but the way that our company, our organization, that it is that you have to be here or something, that like that geographic,
I think
that geographic discrimination, I don't know if that's a thing or could be.
I think it would depend on a lot of other factors for it to boil down to discrimination. So if there are other factors and that, then yes, I think you could get potentially, there could be some issues there. But I think by and large right now, just geographically, I don't think there's a legal like lawsuit type of thing you'd have to worry about. However, what I will say, and this is where I think it will be really interesting to watch, is how businesses start to fight for talent and how that shifts what they do, right? Because I think it's, talent wars are real. And when you've got competing companies and they, you're trying to find the best people, I think if I'm over here as company A and I offer all the bells and whistles and you can work remote, and company B over here has some bells and whistles, but then it starts to change your ability to attract the talent. And so that's where I actually think we'll start to see the shuffle. So I don't think I could be completely wrong because you never know how things will change, but I think more so it will be that as opposed to lawsuits, unless you add another element to that particular equation.
Got it. Interesting.
Yeah.
Exciting. Stephanie, I saw you come off of, you turn your video on. Did you have a question with Erin before we wrap up?
I did. My team has worked remotely since I was hired about 4 or 5 years ago. And our team, they closed the St. Louis office and they said, oh, we're going to go remote. So we were a test balloon for kind of the rest of North America to start doing a hybrid, in and out. And it worked so well that in New York, they have 3 floors. Well, pre-COVID had remodeled 3 floors of the World Trade Center, but didn't have an actual desk for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So that was another test balloon, and that worked out well. And I've worked remotely, not just across the country, but in other countries. What do you see that as becoming a trend for younger workers or workers who can work remote?
I think that we will see it. Again, I think that the COVID landscape has started to change how job seekers, what their expectations are. So I do think we're going to see a shift in that, because I just think people at this time have realized the balance, right, of working remote. And I think the benefits of it to their psyche, to their, their ability to focus, their ability to get things done, to feel satisfied. I think all of those things will start to shift. And I think as people start to demand it, I think businesses are going to have to rise up and find a way to meet in some way, shape, or form. Now, what that looks like, we don't know yet, but I do think businesses are going to have to find a way to meet them in the middle. What I think will be interesting as well is to see, when we talk about technology, what sort of technology is built to help engagement with remote work, right? So what sort of platforms will we see that will really push engagement so that from a culture standpoint, people still feel a part of something? Because I do think it's a big fear of businesses, right? Is losing that, as Sarah even mentioned, it's a big fear of losing what makes us us. So, but I think we've created and done enough things differently that now it's just a matter of time before we start to see these different things come on board that will allow us to do something pretty cool virtually.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. We are a little over time at 10:30. Of course, if anyone needs to run, feel free to, but depending on timing, I don't know, Vicki, I know you kind of come up and on video, or Susie, anyone else have any follow-up questions while we have this invaluable time with our friend Erin to ask questions?
Hi, yes, I would love to ask Erin, and this is really not COVID related as much, and we could probably do a whole workshop on just this, Erin, which I think would be valuable, is just questions in hiring someone, what to look for, what pitfalls and everything, you know?
Well, and you're right. I could talk for hours and hours and hours about that and all the different things to look for and and it's how you set yourself up as a business owner too, in terms of preparing for a successful interview, because I think so often we come ill prepared. And so we don't actually dial into the things we should be dialing into when we are interviewing, and we make snap judgments when we shouldn't be making snap judgments. And I do think actually with COVID, I'm sure that was a big, what is the word I'm looking for? We had to cut our teeth on that a little bit in March, right? Because everybody had to figure out, how do I assess differently when I'm not seeing somebody face to face? And it's very different. But yeah, I think it could be a full other hour session on how to tips and tricks to dialing into who the person really is and getting a right hire.
Yeah, it's so true. There's such an art and a science to it, and so much. And we've got our own, what is it like? There's a science that you want to hire people that like your knee-jerk reaction is to hire someone that's like you. When
Yes.
really, and they're like, oh my gosh, I could see myself grabbing drinks and coffee with this person and being friends. It's like, hold on, you're not hiring it's not a dating show for friends. This
Yes.
is hiring for a position and asking for skill sets and all of that. I mean, so yeah, you have to be super conscious and eyes wide open when it comes into hiring, and so much to think about and look for.
And same thing again for referrals, right? So our employee refers us somebody and they're great. So we're automatically like, this person's going to be amazing. And so we sometimes lay off some of the harder questions because we just think it's going to be fine. Yeah. And it even goes back to, I can't remember who was talking about hiring a friend. And it's a thing, right? Because sometimes it works really, really well, but there's a lot of intricacies that come with that, and really vetting out, is the person the right person for the job, right?
Yeah, my husband works for a family business, and I always there are a lot of relatives and extended relatives and really close friends, sons, and things that work for the company. Not that my husband hired, but that, he inherited. And I'm like, don't hire someone you can't fire, because that's
true story.
Got to be comfortable that you can fire this person and still see them at Thanksgiving, and that's going to be okay. So I don't know if that's really the right, but I've heard that phrase before, and I've certainly used it on him before. So
well, and I from personal experience, when I was much younger, hired a good friend of mine, and it was very hard to fire and maintain any form of relationship, right? And that person expected me to be less, leader-ish to her because we were friends. And so there's this whole dynamic that comes into the workplace that you just have to be prepared to manage, right?
Yeah, definitely.